Um, so, so with that, I call the August 17th meeting of the Reimagining Public Safety Committee to order. And as always, we'll begin with public comment. Is there any member of the public, that's to say anybody not a member of the committee, who would like to make a comment for this meeting? Okay, seeing none, thanks you to members of the public for being here for the conversation and for your continued input. The next item is approval of the minutes from the meeting 2 weeks ago that Shanika circulated. Does anyone care to make a motion regarding approval of the minutes?
So moved.
So Patrick Keenan-Devlin moves approval of the August 3rd, 2021 minutes as circulated. Is there a second?
Second.
Kimberly Walton seconds. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
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 All opposed say nay. The ayes have it and the minutes are adopted. And this brings us to item number 4, which is, you may recall that last time Patrick indicated that the Moran Center was interested in proposing kind of a path for the kind of ideas and support they could provide regarding public engagement. And I know that the Moran Center has done some thinking and work in that direction. So I want to turn over to Patrick to share with us his thoughts.
Thanks, Mayor Biss. I said to the mayor prior to today, I don't know if what I have to say is ready for prime time, but for those of you who know me, I don't know if I've ever been ready for prime time. So I'm just going to go and tell you what I'm thinking, or I should say, more importantly, what my team is thinking. So this committee has been charged with a rather ambitious, visionary charge, which is, reimagining safety, what safety is, and in order to do that, we know, right? I remember we said it at the first meeting when we convened. We have to have community help us define what that is. It can't just be the 17 of us or however many there are of us defining what safety is. We need to engage community. With that being said, and I mean no disrespect to city staff who work tirelessly and to even our beloved mayor who's on this call, but I think that there is a divide between City Hall presently and the community. And I think that in order to solicit feedback intentionally, authentically, community has to really feel welcomed and in relationship with us, in relationship with government. And so our thought was, when we met with Mayor Biss to talk about the first steps in having community engage in this process, is, well, before you engage community and ask them their thoughts on safety, we first have to build relationship with community. And that takes time. And what I have learned as a restorative justice practitioner, we have Nathan Norman on, who's a Kingian nonviolence practitioner. All of this takes time. I have to just say that out loud. It does take time. And I hope that our committee will invest in the time to engage in the work of community building and community relationshiping, which is a total Moran Center word. Don't ever use it outside of this meeting. And in that, we wanted to do a little experiment first. So the Moran Center actually, with Nathan Norman at the Youth and Young Adult Division, have done a lot of training of community members in restorative practices and holding circle to have really difficult, complex conversations. And what I invited the mayor to do was to come and sit in circle with restorative justice practitioners that are in 8th grade to restorative justice practitioners that are in their 90s, and to sit in circle and to have an experience as to how restorative justice, Kingian nonviolence practices actually foster community building and community relationships, and think through relying on our youth and our elders who are trained in these practices to help us think through, help him think through, and hopefully then extension us think through how we build community, and then ultimately, after forming those relationships, those bonds, seek input on how they envision safety and how our work should be guided by their voices. And so the thought again is Mayor sits in circle, and then we use that time to really organically think about how to engage then the wider committee in these practices as a launching point for building wider community relationships. So that's what we're thinking that is really missing before we really start talking about engaging community, surveying community in defining public safety. So that's the next step we're proposing. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, let me first open it up to anybody who wants to react or ask for more information or clarification or share their own thoughts.
Hi, Patrick. I definitely agree with the comment that you made about the disconnect between citizens and the city. And I think I was speaking to Councilmember Burns earlier today, and and I know this is the public safety component, but I can tell literally from our economic development to our wards and recreational centers to now public safety that all of us are having the same conversation, including Equity and Empowerment Commission, around community engagement. And I know for one, as staff, I have, and I am working on a framework around community engagement, where it's a process that should be able to tie these different things together. We're not quite there yet. I'm very much in draft mode, right? And looking at the different ways that we could connect the dots here, but it's so encouraging and confirmation as to hearing you say it, talking to Councilman Burns, talking to Paul Zamazak around all these different ways to engage for these different reasons, public safety, economic development, and things of that nature. So I do look forward, hopefully soon, to be able to, tie some of what I'm doing on the equity end into what's happening here. But I just want you to know that it's definitely recognized and definitely something that's being looked into.
That's great. I love hearing about synergy.
Thanks so much, Shanika. I really, and I just want to underscore that. And sorry, Kimberly, I saw your hand. You'll be next. But I've also had the exact same experience Shanika just outlined, that everywhere I go, there's whether it's talking about issues of equity or public safety or housing or climate or environmental justice, the first question on folks' minds is, how do we reach out to the community in a more comprehensive and more inclusive and more effective way?
What I would say just quickly in response to that, and then Kim, I want to hear your question or thoughts or comments. Is in Evanston, we talk a lot about community engagement. And I've lived here for nearly 20 years. And in that 20-year time, I've gone to a lot of town halls and I've filled out a lot of surveys. And I have sat in many community forums. And this, what we're thinking about, or what we're asking the city and all of us to think more about is, before you get to the engagement, before you get to the survey, before you get to the community forum, how are you building relationships first? Because how often have we all gone to a community forum where a community member stands up and speaks a harm that they've felt perpetrated by the city? And then the city facilitator, not knowing how to respond, goes, okay, next speaker, next speaker, next speaker. And that's harm. That's further harm that the city just perpetrated. And then of course the person leaves even angrier than when they came. And it's because we didn't start in that moment, in that conversation with a relationship. And that facilitator would have known what to do if they were in relationship with that person, right? So anyway, it's just flipping the priorities and really starting with relationships before you get to engagement.
Yeah, strongly read. I could say I have a lot that I'm inclined to say, but also I think it's time for me to stop talking. So yes to all of that, and let me call on Kimberly now. Are others unable to hear?
Maybe frozen.
Yeah, hold on 1 second. Let me shoot her a quick text.
Can you hear me now? Sorry, my.
Yes.
I just had a question. No groundbreaking thoughts or anything. I just want to understand. So we're saying that before we actually develop a plan to engage community members, that we first want to invite someone or some groups to attend the restorative justice circles. Was that sort of the summary of what you were saying? I'm sorry if I missed kind of the actual plan.
No, that's okay, Kimberly. I don't know if I was really explicit. It's one of my downfalls. What the plan would be is that Moran Center, again, along with the Youth and Young Adult Division, have done a lot of work over the years to train young people, elders, and actually everybody in between, to be restorative justice practitioners and Kingian nonviolence practitioners, and have done a lot of work and intentional work in thinking about building community and how you do that. And so as a first step, to see if really this is something that the mayor wanted to take prime time, to invite him first to a circle, though of course we could open it up to all committee members too, but at least prioritizing having that initial meeting with Mayor Biss, where we were very clear to him, and I will say it on public record too, it's not a town hall, not a listening tour, right? He would be just one of many people sitting in a circle, thinking about how we as a city could engage in community building. And then really one of my other key objectives, and this is sometimes the tension of restorative practices, you have to allow the circle to really organically drive the agenda, and yet you can also have a little bit of an agenda before you go in. And so one of my agendas or objectives is that out of that circle, we also think about how we widen the circle and bring this to this committee, and how can we do that in an Open Meetings Act, complying with the Open Meetings Act and complying with all the other any rules and regs that we are bound by as a committee, but still have a real conversation and sit in circle and have authentic dialogue about how we can further this idea of community building. Because if the Reimagining Public Safety Committee doesn't start with community building, there's not another committee in the city of Evanston that will start with community building. I mean, we have to be the ones, I think, to model this for the entire city. So that was the idea, Kimberly.
Okay. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question to something you said in your response, Patrick? I was inclined to ask this in the opening, and then I realized we hadn't orchestrated in advance, and I didn't want to put you on the spot, but then you opened the door to it, so now I'm going to put you on the spot. I would imagine there may be other folks on the committee who are hearing about this and are saying, sure, but why just Daniel? Are you in fact comfortable opening that initial invitation up to the whole committee?
Yeah, I think so. I think the only thing that gets a little tricky, and I'm actually looking on this call, like I know several people on this call who've been in a restorative justice circle, know that the bigger it gets, kind of the harder it gets, right? Because time is of the essence and you only have so much time to get all the voices in. But I think we can figure it out. We'll make it work. We'll totally make it work.
I mean, one compromise might be to pick a time and say how many slots you're comfortable adding, and then let it be
Good idea.
first come, first serve or something for that many slots.
Okay, so
Go ahead.
if no one else has any other questions, I will admit I'm not quite following what we're doing here. So I'll just be the one to put myself out there on a limb, and hopefully it will help others understand as well. Maybe I'm just having an off day here, but so the idea, I understand conceptually what a restorative justice circle is about. I've never participated in one, but I know and I understand the concept, right? So like, are we saying that like we want to adopt this practice as a way to elicit feedback from the community about the goals and priorities that we have? Or are we sitting in on a restorative justice circle that someone else is, talking about a separate issue, and we're just sort of learning how the circle works, and then we're figuring out how do we adapt this? I guess I'm just struggling with like, how do we go from starting here to actually getting the community input? And are we looking, is this just sort of like I won't say experiment, but sort of an innovative step for us? Or are we also looking to invite the community to some sort of circles later that would help elicit this type of feedback?
You should have presented this for me, because you said it 10 times better than I did. I think the first thing that you said is the objective, is to, because some of us have sat in a restorative circle, some of us haven't, and some of us know what it is, some of us don't. Some of us might know what it is and think it's lousy as a lousy forum for gathering feedback. But I think you hit the nail on the head. At least my thought was to invite the mayor, but then again, anybody who wants to be part of it and can to sit in circle and to see, to your point, Kimberly, if this would be a good means by which to facilitate conversations in the community around public safety and reimagining public safety. So that would be one of the key objectives of having this experiment. I love that word. I think that's the right word to use. Is this a really good tool? Now, I'm totally biased. I think it's the greatest tool ever. But I want you all and the mayor to experience it with community members to see, is this really a tool that we want to buy into as a way to have conversation in the community around reimagining public safety? So I loved how you framed that, Kimberly.
Okay, that's helpful. So one other thought, and then I will let other voices speak up, but how do you propose this plan in terms of like our long-term objective of being able to inform some budget recommendations in the October, November timeframe? Like, we would want to do that with community input. So would we have, like, I guess from a timing perspective, would we sort of roll this out as, let's say this strategy works and we all agree we want to do these circles, as one of our ways of gathering feedback. Would that be the only way that you could participate and give your feedback? Or would there be sort of like options, and different sort of channels for feedback gathering over a period of time, keeping in mind that we want to get the most feedback by a certain day, or some milestone in order to meet Mayor Biss's objective or our collective objective of having a thoughtful budget recommendation? Is that how this could shape up? Or
I would defer to the mayor on that, but I love answering questions, so I'm going to answer that question too, and just say that I think, my philosophy in life is everything's both and. So I think it's both and. I think that you can utilize, traditional community engagement tools if you have, a deadline, and the mayor may have a deadline of October, and we have budget, and I need community input. But what the Moran Center is proposing, what I'm proposing, is that we need to also do the hard work of repairing harm and engaging in the hard work of community building and community relationshiping. And that will take time, and I will guarantee you it's going to take a lot longer than this current budget cycle. But I think that if the city is to address a whole host of harms and issues surrounding safety, again, my recommendation would be that this committee be the ones to experiment with engaging in restorative practices as a way of facilitating, Kimberly, as you said, community conversations and community dialogue on a whole host of topics. But we can be the experimenters and be the ones to start with community dialoguing around safety, public safety, I should say. That's at least my thought. But
Okay.
Mayor Biss, I let you answer that question.
Thank you, Patrick.
Yeah, but I suppose I could answer too. I don't, I think that ultimately it's going to be necessary to use a variety of different tactics, and there's a kind of a depth of conversation and engagement. And I'm sorry, I can't do it, so I'm going to go with relationship building rather than relationshiping. But you can keep training me, Patrick, and I'll get there eventually, perhaps. That is not so much about quantitative data, but a kind of a qualitative discussion that has really deep value, that may not replace the need to do more traditional surveys and town halls and all that stuff. But I do think there's value in intending to both seek to use restorative practices in this discourse, and also, relatedly, try to have real conversations about why are we in this room, and what are we really talking about? What are we really envisioning as a part of that process? I also think that Nathan got cut off at some point. Were you trying to jump in, Nathan?
I was, but I was just really basically speaking to what I think Kimberly had talked about, and I was just basically building on Patrick's point that we've seen a lot of town halls, and I think that he was just basically saying that using the circle would be a fresh tactic, and not only engaging community, but by the circle being more intimate, being more inviting, individuals would feel like they had some sense of engagement and involvement in the process, and we probably would get better results would spring forth, is what I was kind of gathering. And that's all I was going to say. But I agree with you, Mayor Biss, as well, that it's going to take multiple tactics to get us to the end result. So that's all I was saying, nothing major.
Are there other questions or reactions for Patrick?
Yes. So who exactly do you have in mind when you're thinking about the circles, in terms of who would show up or be invited, right, outside of the mayor and perhaps people from this committee? I ask because I am always concerned about survivors having space for feedback, and we're typically, at least those who I know in Evanston, are not invited to restorative circles, even with the harm doers in our cases. So I'm just curious, how we would be considered in such a practice.
Sorry, I was muted. For restorative justice practices to work, and this is my training, survivors have to be centered in practice. And I think often when restorative justice practices are done poorly and cause further harm, that is when victims are not centered. Actually, I think circles can't happen unless victims are centered and survivors are not centered in those conversations. And I think that's one of the key principles of restorative practices. With that said, the vision of this, at least initial circle, is that, and a quick side note, restorative practices, and so I actually, and I apologize if I have been consistently using the phrase restorative justice. I should actually use the phrase restorative practices as opposed to restorative justice, because restorative practices is a larger umbrella that encompasses a lot of different, let's call it mediation tactics and dialoguing. So when I think you ask Joe on the street, like, what's restorative justice? If he knows anything, he might say it's offender victim mediation, right? But restorative practices also is just a way of dialoguing. And so when we sit in circle, for example, with the mayor, it will be just a series of questions that that are prompted by the circle. And in this area will be, how do we engage community? How do we build relationships? And who I would want to be around that room are, young people that we, the Youth and Young Adult Division spent a lot of time, energy, and resources this summer training young people in restorative values and principles and practices. And I think they could be incredible ambassadors for the city in engaging community members in restorative practice. So I would want them to be there. We've also done a lot of work in our faith communities, particularly elders in our faith communities. And they are now trained facilitators. And so I'd want them to be in circle with us. We also have incredible internationally renowned circle keepers who actually live in Evanston. And I'd want them to be in circle with us too, to model how we engage in conversation within a circle format. So that would be who I'd want in the room. And I apologize that I think I've consistently used that phrase restorative justice, where I really should have used the phrase restorative practices, because in this instance, there may be a victim and there may be someone who has caused harm, and that's true in any circle that you enter into. And if that does arise in the course of the circle, that person needs to be centered. There needs to be centered, and we need, as a circle, to then address that person's needs immediately. Thank you for that question. Thank you for helping me clarify my point too, Evangeline.
Did that answer your question, Evangeline?
I think so. I mean, I think that's also the tricky part, right? Though, is that, being very clear on what it is and what it isn't, and that, that it's a method, but it's not necessarily going to serve in our individual cases or our individual realities, right? What we've experienced in terms of harm in the city or unsafe situations in the city. So I think that's important. But I also do want to caution that there's a need to bring survivors to the table. I am one of many. And also, how do we do that in a way that centers them, but also gives space for that feedback to come in. And sometimes that's not in a public setting. Sometimes it's not in a forum like this, right? And so I just want to make sure that as we're talking about community engagement, that we're also thinking of all the different layers that we'll probably need to include.
Beautifully said.
Thank you. Before we move on, does anyone else have any last questions or thoughts on this for Patrick? If not, then does anyone have any concerns or objections about moving forward with this idea?
None.
I don't, oops. Sorry, go ahead, Councilman.
Oh, I was just answering the question with none. No concerns. I think it's a good idea.
So I don't have any concerns. I want to echo Evangeline's comment, though. I think, and by the way, I'm a fan of restorative practices. I participated in 2 weeks ago in Austin neighborhood in Chicago. I've been doing them for years. I think making sure we understand what the objective is to inform this committee on, and importantly, when I look at the people in this committee, the more I learn, we're not starting from zero. And so especially when we're talking about victims, to have victims retell their stories in a space where they've told them before, for us to hear, I would just caution that, right? Like, what do we want to get out of the peace circle? Is it these different definitions of public safety that we don't know about? I think we should be clear about what the objective is. And the second thing I would say, and you raised this, Patrick, and I'm glad you did, and Evangeline raised this too, like, can we follow up? Is it the committee's job to follow up and make sure they get referrals for services? Is the Moran Center going to lead that effort? Because if we go and we listen to these things and the solution is, but we're a committee that can't do anything about it, we're actually then just gonna re-traumatize folks that are living through these experiences. So I always wanna make sure when we're in those contexts, you know, that we are getting information that will help inform our decisions and experiencing it. But like, you know, if we can't do anything about it, I worry about that. And I worry about listening and hearing and doing something. And then our answer is we can't do anything. Are we that better than, say, moving on? We're just doing it with more words. And I don't think anybody wants to do that. So I just want to make sure that as we do that, we know what the goal is of those particular circles. So restorative practices around something, that a harm that's happened in a neighborhood has a goal of restoring some kind of element in a neighborhood. More broadly understanding environment in a school or whatever, they have very particular goals. Now we're opening up to a whole city potentially where everybody has competing things. So I just want to make sure, my concern is that it's a circumscribed set of things and that we can deliver on whatever might come up in there, because then otherwise we're just failing again.
Can I add to that? I know you all
Please.
asked for last minute, but to Evangeline and both Andy's point, and yours too, Patrick, I think sometimes what I found to be one of the biggest struggle is I do hear a lot of, well, we've been surveyed so many times, we've been through these workshops X amount of times, we've talked about, you know, all these different racial barriers and or public safety issues and violence, and, you know, nothing's been done. So, you know, so I get where you're coming from, Patrick, about how do we bridge that communication, or better yet, that trust. And I think for me, even I struggle with how do we approach that, because it is first of all, to even start this work, you're right, you have to gain the attention and the trust of the community to even say, let's sit in this room and have this conversation yet again about, however, so the approach definitely has to be different. I would say, and you know, to Andy's point and Evangeline's, narrowing it down to what are the most important issues to tackle firsthand, because there are a lot of barriers and there are a lot of issues that we can all address and we can all agree that exist in Evanston. But it's trying to find that, I don't want to say the main issue, but you know what I mean, what prioritizes first? What do we need to address first when approaching this conversation?
And Daniel, if I could just
Please.
say one last thing, which is the objective, at least in my mind, and again, I don't control this committee or this work going forward, but in my mind, it would be to build community. And restorative practices can do that, and can do that incredibly well. And I really appreciate Andy and Evangeline raising, though, that whenever you enter into circle, and this is the God's honest truth, and so I'm so glad both of you said it, that even if your objective is community building, which sounds really nice, right? Harms can be raised in that circle. And you actually want them to be, because you want people to be authentic and you want to be in just relationship with those that you're entering into circle with. So Andy and Evangeline, thank you for raising that, because if we're not prepared to go into these circles to address people's needs, then we're just perpetrating the town hall forums where somebody stood up and said they had a harm and we're saying, okay, next speaker. So no, I really, really appreciate that, that warning. Thank you for that.
No, and if I just may include one thought, is that I think, though, you know, just again, I think, you know, all the issues raised are very integral. But I think that in order for us to start to repair harm, in order for us to start to build and heal community, we have to know the symptoms, right? So we have, and I mean, in my experience, the last almost going on a decade working with individuals that fit this criteria, we have to really give them a seat at the table. We have to engage them so that we can ascertain what are those issues, right? So that we can begin to start the repair or the healing process with individuals. So I think that, you know, this is a good avenue that segues into that. And I think that is, I think that it'll be helpful for sure. But I really appreciate Andy and everyone else who raised those concerns, because those are valuable. Those are definitely valuable concerns.
Yeah, I really, I really agree with that. I mean, I think, you know, I totally appreciate the sense in which the word experiment was used, but I think that word can come off as a little bit flip because, you know, it does sound a little bit like we're just sort of playing a game with, you know, the people who are asking to put themselves in a position which is intimate and vulnerable and can be re-traumatizing. So I think that caution about the stakes of doing this both intentionally and correctly is really important. So thank you.
To be fair, we only wanted to experiment with you, Mayor Bess.
Oh. I'm down for that anytime.
All right. And then hopefully, you know, with, you know, coming back to this group and thinking collectively, we can be really clear, as Andy and Evangeline said, about what the objectives are, how we build infrastructure. And so it's really intentional and really brings about better conversation and community relationships.
Great. So Patrick, the next immediate step then is for you to begin to put this together essentially and communicate with us?
Yes, so I will just be asking for dates as my next step.
Great. Thank you. Thanks everyone for the engagement of this. Really, that's terrific. This brings us to item 5 on our agenda, which is the long-suffering effort to put some of the values that drive our work in writing. A huge thank you to Sarah Bogan, who actually, because of her day job, is not able to join us this afternoon, but who really devoted some serious effort to producing an initial draft of a document, which I made a couple modest edits to and then sent around to the group, unfortunately only late last night. I want to be clear, you know, there's 17 of us and 2 of us had laid eyes on this when it was sent around. So it is designed to be a preliminary document. The expectation is that not everything is going to be agreed upon by everyone, that there will be things missing, but I thought, you know, putting some actual prose in front of folks to start from rather than a blank piece of paper was important. So I first want to ask, I got some feedback already in writing from one person, which is terrific. So I first want to ask if anybody wanted to just share, if anyone's ready already now this afternoon to share feedback on the document that was sent around late last night.
So I apologize. I don't see the document in my inbox. If someone has it handy, I'd appreciate it if you could forward it. I could totally have missed that. I'm sorry, but
yeah, I'm gonna just double check that it went to you because there's bigger problems in place if it didn't. It did, so maybe it went to spam or something. Let me
Well,
check.
It's actually copied in the body of the email, so you might.
oh, okay. Okay, thank you. I was looking for an attachment. I'll look
Oh,
at
I'm sorry, my bad, my
No, no.
bad. It should be bumped to the top of your inbox now. So I don't want to force folks to kind of read. I mean, I'm happy to do that if folks want, but I also might not be the best way to make use of everyone's time. so one option is just to ask folks to submit comments to me and Sarah in writing. Another option that I would be happy to do, a little more sort of radical transparency, but perhaps consistent with the spirit of the exercise, would be to create a publicly viewable Google Doc. It couldn't be a Google Doc just for the committee for Open Meetings Act reasons and probably for general transparency principles, but I could create a publicly available Google Doc and folks could make suggestions directly in there over the course of the next couple of weeks if that's a preferred option. Any preferences? Or we can just read it and talk about it
I
now.
think the Google Doc is a good idea.
Do others want to weigh in, thumbs up or thumbs down on the Google Doc? All right, look at all those thumbs ups. They're everywhere. Okay, well, I will make a note to myself now. And we will get that sent around to the group ASAP.
Just a technical question on the Google Doc. Would you want us to just add comments, or are you gonna have it in editing mode? Like, how would you like us to?
My inclination would be that
doesn't mess up everything.
Yeah, my inclination would be that people add only comments or suggestions rather than edits that delete whatever's being replaced. I mean, this is a bit of an experiment. It'll be a publicly, I don't think, well, I could see about giving editing privileges just for the 17 people in the committee, but I think that may be a technology or perhaps even an OMA problem. So I'm more inclined to make it open with the understanding that if really people kind of get into it, you're going to have it'll become an unreadable document soon and we'll have to kind of think of a plan B. But I'd like to start by just, sending it around, and if folks have either comments or recommended changes, just make them in suggestion mode so that we don't wind up with, without a trace of what was there before. Great, so that's on my to-do list. I will get on that tonight. And that brings us to item 6, which is the working group report out. I believe that the violence prevention group did not meet last week. And so if that's correct, let's start with the group that's rethinking the organizational structure of the EPD. It's Councilmember Burns.
Yes, yeah, we are in a similar place that we were last week. So we are holding firm on exploring 2 topics. One being, what does it look like to have a kind of a same day immediate response to substance use treatment in Evanston, and what will be required out of our hospitals and other treatment facilities run through different nonprofits in Evanston. The idea is if we were to rethink our response to drug possession in particular, and I think Councilmember Reed would want to explore expanding that to delivery as well, but certainly possession. If we were to rethink our response to drug possession from a punitive one that leads to incarceration to one that leads to treatment, we will really need our organizations to who provide substance use treatment to really they would need the staff to support that transition. And right now it doesn't appear that is the case. So we're working with Maureen from Peer Services, and we'll have other speakers on in the next few weeks to really, from the hospitals and other places around the community to talk about what type of investment will we need to make in the treatment that we provide in Evanston, and the staff that we have to support that work in order to to really make this big switch in the way we respond to this in Evanston. So, you know, we also had a really interesting, a simple but to me a really important idea about how part of the same day or same day response could be skipping intake, right? So for a lot of our services that we provide, you have to go through this paperwork process in the beginning. And peer services were saying what they've explored is saying, look, we don't need to go through the intake and the paperwork day one. Maybe day one, you're talking to a counselor or a therapist or someone day one. Maybe even to Patrick's point, you're getting into a peace circle day one. Maybe you're invited to a larger group conversation and workshop with your peers on day two. But just seeing how we can provide immediate services to people day one, day two, day three, instead of taking them through this long, drawn out intake process where, you know, they lose hope and they're not getting the support they need. So, but basically we're just trying to figure out what do we need to design in Evanston to change the way we respond to drug possession, substance use. And then the other part of it is really looking at what type of officers do we want in Evanston? Do we want law enforcement officers, which by state code that has its own definition? Do we want peace officers? Will we like sheriffs? Will we like some other role that we come up with locally? And really trying to define what we want in Evanston and why, based on what the state allows those different roles to do, and based on the type of service we want those individuals to provide here in Evanston. So again, we're still looking at state code and trying to get a better sense of the type of employees we would like helping us achieve public safety in Evanston. So that is the update. Oh, and then at the next meeting, we'll have Patrick and a law clerk from Moran Center were kind enough to put together a memo on all of this. And so they'll be reporting out at our next meeting. And Maureen is having someone from Peer Services who works at St. Francis Hospital providing substance use treatment to speak to the group about their experience at St. Francis. And those are the two things we have for the upcoming meeting.
That's great. Thank you. Any questions for Bobby? Okay. And that brings us to the last group, which is focusing on data and patrol and traffic. So we began our discussion about the big data sets we've been given that we'll have more to report on when we've had more time to truly dig into it. The bulk of our discussion was with Sergeant Scott Safir from EPD. He's spent a lot of his career in the pardon me, sorry, spent a lot of his career in community policing, and currently he's heading up traffic. And he just wanted to, at my request of the department, gave kind of an EPD perspective on the question of civilian traffic enforcement. And he raised, as you might guess, he had some questions and concerns about it. We talked a lot about the potential for best ways to ensure safety of the person conducting traffic stops, whether that's a civilian or a sworn officer, and share different thoughts about that. And then also talked a lot about escalation and de-escalation for the individual being stopped as well. And I would just say that I was really encouraged by the discussion. I think it probably won't surprise anybody that there were, I would say on average, pretty different views held by the majority of the people in the working group as compared with Sergeant Safir. And I found it to be a constructive, respectful back and forth. First of all, that I learned from, and I think the working group learned from, but also that, I think is of a a modality of discourse that will be helpful to us. That some of these conversations, I think, for obvious reasons, have had a kind of a difficult tone or even a confrontational tone. And I was really, really just kind of favorably impressed by the working group and Sergeant Safir's ability to have a really kind of different tone of discussion that I think was helpful. So I really appreciated that, and think that we'll be able to have kind of continued discussions where there may well not be agreement, but where there's first of all an exchange of information, but also an exchange of ideas and thoughts that will, even if no one's persuaded to change their mind, I think will make everybody more effective at kind of understanding all sides of the argument and devising a policy that really works and makes sense. So it was encouraging. And before we break, I just want to add that I do think we have a confirmation for 2 weeks from today, August 31st, our next meeting. We will have a visit from the ACLU, which, to reiterate my answer to Patrick's question from last time, it's the ACLU national office with support from their Illinois team, to share with us some of what they've done in a variety of communities out of state, actually, and what they've seen progressive communities who want to be really trying bold ideas around public safety do in some other states. Additionally, the Alliance for Safety and Justice they continue to be interested in doing their training and discussions with the various working groups. And I've communicated with both Andy and Councilmember Burns. Their request would be to essentially be the agenda or the main part of the agenda for one working group meeting in September. And if that's okay with those two working groups, I'll just give the green light, and we'll work on scheduling and moving forward to get those trainings on the calendar. Thank you. And with that, we've reached the end of our agenda. A miracle has occurred. It's a little bit before 5 o'clock. Thank you very much, everybody, for your thoughtful engagement in this conversation and this work. I really appreciate it. And seeing no further business.
Daniel, I
Yep.
hate to be the kid who like raises his hand and say like, "Ooh, can I have like more homework?" Betty, put your fist down. Come on, Betty.
I think Betty is just observing that this is the second time you've done this recently.
I do it all the time. I actually was the kid who raised his hand and said, "Hey, do you have homework, teacher?" And Betty probably did slug me in the playground.
Wow.
I just wanted to quickly say, I promise it'll take like less than 20 seconds, is just to give a big shout out to Nathan Norman and his team at the Youth and Young Adult Division. You know, this committee, I know, has a working group that's engaged in thinking about violence prevention and intervention. But the city really led, and talk about community building, by the way, just incredible work this year. So the city should really be applauded on its work with the My City, Your City, Our City initiative. And I really do believe that we had a safer summer because of the city's efforts, the Youth and Young Adult team's efforts. And I thought this would be a good place to say thank you for them and for their work. We're incredibly lucky to have them. So I just wanted to say that.
Well, thank you for that. And I will definitely echo my appreciation of Nathan and the whole team over at the Youth and Young Adult Division for an incredible amount of effort that, as you say, really appears to be paying off this summer. And just on a personal note, I'll add, Nathan has been a really generous teacher of mine, and I'm benefiting a lot from that, and I know I'll continue to benefit from it. So thank you for the care and time that you give to that effort. It means a lot to me.
Oh, no worries. Thank you so much, Mayor Biss. I truly appreciate that. Thank you, Patrick. The team is I do believe that it really contributed to a safer summer as well. And Audrey really championed that, and she really laid it out. So I appreciate that. And I'll definitely let her know your warm sentiments as well as the rest of the team.
Thank you. And with that, with no further business coming before the Committee on Reimagining Public Safety, our August 17th meeting stands adjourned. Thanks so much, everybody.